Hello everyone and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I am bringing you a book trilogy review. And today I'm going to be reviewing the Star Wars Thrawn trilogy, the canon Thrawn trilogy. And the three books within this trilogy are Thrawn, Thrawn Alliances, and finally Thrawn Treason. And these were released in the late 2010s. I believe the first one came out in 2017. And I think one was released each year up until 2019. And these books, I believe, were the first books that Timothy Zahn wrote for the canon for Star Wars. Of course, he was a very popular writer back in the EU. He kind of basically started the EU. I mean, there were some books that came out prior to Heir to the Empire, which came out in 1993, I believe. And there were some other books that came out before then, but he, with Heir to the Empire and the rest of that trilogy, basically started the EU. So he's a very popular author within the Star Wars community, and they brought him back to write these books after Thrawn was reintroduced in the TV show Star Wars Rebels. And he also has gone on to write another Thrawn trilogy called the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, which I have not read, but I've heard very good things about. But I'm basically going to talk about each book individually, my thoughts on each of them, and then go into all three as a whole. So I'm going to start off with Thrawn, of course, the first book. This book, they all kind of have a unique kind of approach to them, all three of these. This one is very much an origin story for Thrawn, and it covers the widest time span, technically. I mean, Thrawn Alliances, I guess, technically covers the largest time span, but this one covers, I believe, a pretty significant amount of time. I don't know exactly how long. But it's basically the time period from Thrawn basically joining the Empire all the way up to him becoming a Grand Admiral. As far as the pros for this book, the big thing for me, really for this trilogy as a whole, but also for this book, is the characters. I love the characters within this trilogy, especially Thrawn, obviously, because he's the main character. I've always liked Thrawn in the books that I've read that he was in the EU, which is not a whole lot. I've read the original Thrawn trilogy along with Choices of One and Outbound Flight, and I think that's all I've read that has him in it. But I've always liked Thrawn, but I've never loved Thrawn. And these books, and especially this one, kind of started for me. These books really made me love Thrawn. There are some other cool characters in here as well. There's a character, Eli Vanto, who has become a fan favorite, it seems. He appears in this book, and he also appears in book 3, and there's some other characters as well. There's Price, whose name I'm not remembering at the moment. I believe she's a character from Rebels. I have not actually seen Rebels, so I don't really know much about her outside of this book. But, you know, she was good, and there were some other characters as well. Tarkin makes some appearances in here. The Emperor makes some appearances. They're all done very well. The characters in general and their interactions I really enjoyed, and they were the thing that really stood out to me the most with this whole trilogy. I also think it was really cool to kind of get an origin for Thrawn within the Empire, and obviously the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy is basically more of an actual origin story for Thrawn, but this is his origin within the actual Star Wars galaxy, you know, that we typically see, and his origin within the Empire. And that was really cool to see. I really enjoyed his story, how he kind of moved up through the ranks. I also really enjoyed, particularly with Thrawn, in this book, but really all three. But I think it stands out the most in this one because there's some, the bits before the chapter begins, I can't remember what they're called off the top of my head. But basically, there's a lot of actually getting into Thrawn's head in this book and in the whole trilogy, but especially this one. Those parts before the chapter are like different, like kind of bits of Thrawn's stuff that's kind of in his head or whatever, or something of the sort. And you get a lot of like his observations. So if a chapter is taking place from his perspective, if he's talking to someone, you will see like his direct observations about the person and how they're acting, about his surroundings. I really enjoyed that about this book. And this book especially really emphasizes Thrawn's intellect and his ability to really see things and understand what's going on and kind of be 2 steps ahead of everyone else. And I think that was really well done. As far as downsides for this book in particular, I mentioned earlier the Price character, who's actually now I think her first name's Arinda. I might be pronouncing that wrong, but Arinda Price. Her parts in this book I thought were okay. Didn't really grab me that much. I was mostly into the Thrawn and Eli Vanto stuff with this book. And, you know, the stuff that happened with other characters kind of detracted from that a little bit. Not that it was bad, but it just wasn't the stuff I was really invested in. But otherwise, I really enjoyed this one. Moving along now to Thrawn Alliances. This one is a very different one from the other two. I mean, they're all unique in some way, like I said earlier, but this one I think is the most unique one, and it's also my favorite of the three, which seems to be a somewhat unpopular opinion. Typically, people go with the first book, and I've seen some people consider the second book their least favorite, some people the third, but either way, this one is typically not the favorite, but it was my favorite. And this book kind of is two stories in one. You get a past storyline and a present storyline. The present storyline deals with Thrawn and Vader, as you can see on the cover here, going on a mission together. And the past storyline is about Thrawn and Anakin Skywalker, who meet during the Clone Wars, as well as Padme also plays a role in that, and some stuff that goes on with them. And so you have the book kind of bouncing between those two storylines, and kind of showing how Thrawn and Anakin interacted, and then to now how Thrawn and Vader, who was Anakin but is now Vader, and how they're interacting, and how Vader is kind of responding to that. And it was just really interesting. And the main thing I was really worried about with this one was the fact that it was basically two stories in one book. Because I didn't realize before I read it that that's what it was, but when I did realize that's what it is, I was like, oh no, you know, there's two different storylines. They're going to be potentially fighting for my attention. They're potentially not going to be as adequately developed, each of them, as they should be. You know, all this stuff I was thinking, you know, maybe it's not going to turn out so well because he didn't focus on just one story for this. But I thought it was actually handled really well, and I was, I think, equally invested in both the past and the present story, which I think was just really well done. And this one, I think, is the most character-focused out of the three books. It definitely has a strong plot as well, but I think this one is where the character interaction really stood out to me. I just loved, you know, Anakin and Thrawn, and then Vader and Thrawn, and Padme was cool too, and some of the characters she gets involved in. This was just a really good character book for me. As far as downsides, I did think that there was a couple of chapters kind of around the 2/3 point, I think, that kind of dropped the ball a little bit for me. They weren't like bad chapters or anything, but it kind of, my interest started to go down a little. But the ending brought that right back up, because I think this book ended very well, and just generally, overall, I really liked this book. The only other thing that I wasn't crazy about is the portrayal of Anakin, which is totally fine. Like, it fits with his portrayal in the Clone Wars, but to me it doesn't really fit his portrayal in the movies. And that's mainly because, in my opinion at least, and I haven't seen all of the Clone Wars, I've only seen a few seasons. I need to watch the rest of it, I just haven't got around to it. To me, his portrayal in the Clone Wars feels way different from his portrayal in the movies. And his portrayal in this book feels more in line with the Clone Wars than the movies. So to me, it doesn't feel entirely like Anakin, but I do recognize that that's probably because it's just fitting more with the Clone Wars, which is totally fine. It's just something that kind of took me out of it a little bit because it's not quite like the Anakin that I know. But otherwise, this was a very, very enjoyable book. I really loved this one. Now that, of course, brings us to Thrawn Treason, Book 3. Now, this one, again, I did really enjoy. I would say it's maybe my least favorite of the three, but that's kind of hard to say because I consider book 1 and 3 on pretty much the same level, so it's kind of hard to choose. But this one may be my least favorite of the three, but it was still very, very good. Again, great characters in here. Again, Thrawn is really interesting in this book, especially towards the end of this book. The final, I guess, encounter that he has in this book, which I'm not going to go too much into detail on for the sake of spoilers, but there is stuff that happens at the end of this book where Thrawn, it really shows, again, his intellect, his ability to stay ahead of everyone else in terms of his strategies and all that stuff, his ability to study his opponents and really understand them to the point that he can just know what he needs to do in order to defeat them and all that stuff. That was super well done. The ending of this book was fantastic. I loved the ending of this book, the whole final part. And if you have read this book, you know what I'm talking about. And I also love the setup for this book. Essentially, this also kind of ties into Rogue One a little bit because it has Director Krennic, and it also references the Death Star project, which of course at the time was codenamed Stardust, I believe. And basically he has to go on this mission to take care of some stuff that is related to the Death Star project that's kind of halting progress. And if he succeeds within, I think, the course of a week, then he gets more funds towards the project that he wants to do, which is for the TIE Defender spaceships. Whereas if he doesn't, then those funds will instead go to the Death Star. So he's trying to kind of achieve this goal, and it was an interesting plot as well. But I think the setup was really good, and the ending was really good. The middle is mainly what brings it down for me. The middle, again, I liked all of this book, but the middle definitely was kind of the low point for me. But I thought that the setup and the whole kind of beginning part was really good, and then the ending was excellent. So it kind of balances out. But anyways, as far as talking about the trilogy as a whole, as I said, great character stuff. I loved the characters in this trilogy. I think, for me, from the Star Wars books that I have read thus far, which in the grand scheme of things is only like relatively small percent of them, but I've read quite a few. And out of all of them, I think the character work in these 3 books is some of the strongest that there is that I have read. Again, love the character of Thrawn in these books. They really kind of elevated him in my mind, because before I liked him, but I didn't love him, and now I am like really invested in him and his character. I love how Timothy Zahn wrote him, and how you really get a little bit more of who he is. Because in like some of the other, like the old EU books that he's in that I've read, he was interesting, but I never felt like you really got a real sense of Thrawn as a character, at least in my opinion. And I think that these books really did that very well. I also really enjoy this trilogy because of the way it's kind of set up, because all 3 books do tie into one another. You know, the first book, you get introduced to Eli Vanto. He shows up in book 3. Book 2, I think, is a little more disconnected. It's kind of this one adventure that Thrawn and Vader goes on, but then stuff that happens in that book is related to book 3. So they are all very definitely connected, but all 3 books feel very different. The first one is like this origin story that takes place over a long time, and you really kind of see where Thrawn began and how he got to where he was. The second book was like this 2 parallel stories that was just kind of a fun adventure, I think. And then the third book was, you know, this mission that Thrawn had to go on that had, for him, some fairly significant stakes to it, with a big action scene at the end. So all 3 books feel very unique, but they also feel like they go together very well. And I think it's a really interesting way to do a trilogy. As far as my ratings for these books, I would give the first book, I think, an 8 out of 10. The second book, Thrawn Alliances, I think I'd give an 8.5. And then Thrawn Treason, I probably would also give an 8. So even though Alliances is my favorite of the 3, I consider them all on a pretty similar level. But anyways, that just about wraps up my thoughts on these books. I really enjoyed them a lot, and I am definitely going to be reading the Ascendancy trilogy at some point. I was interested in it before, for sure, because I want to read all of the Star Wars books eventually, which is going to be a very difficult task. But I want to do it eventually, so I was planning to read them, but I wasn't like super excited to do it. But now, after reading these books, I am very excited to read those, and while I probably won't get to them for a while because I have so many other books I need to read at the moment, I am definitely very much looking forward to getting to those at some point. So let me know down in the comments what your thoughts are on this trilogy. If you have read it, what's your favorite book in the trilogy, if it happens to be different from mine, or even if it's the same as mine. Let me know down in the comments which one was your favorite, and your thoughts on the trilogy as a whole. And that is pretty much it for this video, so thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.